So, if you're looking for us to talk about Bayern against Leipzig, I have to disappoint. That show that's been fully and utterly covered on this podcast on the Substack. I think we spent 45 minutes on it yesterday, Stefan. So, we break the entirety of the match down on that podcast. So if you're not a subscriber yet and you're looking for a preview on Bayern against Leipzig, I urge you to check that out. I think we really go in depth for that match, and I think it's going to be a great game. The Friday night fixture, it's an excellent way for the Bundesliga, I think, to kick off the final match day before Christmas. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Needless to say, there's some really good other games on the schedule this week as well, including Frankfurt against Mainz, which is the Rhein-Main derby. It's a pretty modern version of that derby, I would say. A lot of people would argue that Kaiserslautern against Mainz is a bigger derby. Of course, you need to play in the same division for it to be a derby. Frankfurt might say the derbies against Kickers Offenbach are bigger derbies. Again, Offenbach haven't been in the Bundesliga or anywhere near the Bundesliga for a very long time. So, in the absence of their other respective rivals, this is the big one for those two clubs. I also think, it's a really interesting fixture to begin with, just looking where those two teams are. Frankfurt in third, right? Depending on how the game ends on Friday, they could go within 3 points of Bayern Munich. Mainz have been excellent. They're in 7th place. They can really jump up the table with a win as well. So there's a ton on the line in this match. I guess the big question is here, do Frankfurt still have the legs to play this game? This is the first time that they had a week off in a really long time. It really felt like the energy has been sapped out of them. They had these 2 defeats against Leipzig in the Pokal and then the Bundesliga, right? And now they're facing Mainz before they're going on a much needed break. I feel like before we talk in depth about Mainz, I think that is an issue that Frankfurt are going to face in this match.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Frankfurt will be one of the teams who are most looking forward to the international break. As you said, they've had to kind of tussle with the added kind of workload of European football. It's got in the way a lot. I think they've done a decent enough job of kind of maintaining a decent record. Obviously, in the Bundesliga, they're obviously doing quite well in terms of, sitting third, I think, going into this game. And I think it's going to be a pretty interesting and unique test for Frankfurt because they do still have that really impressive home record. They're obviously sitting on 4 wins and 2 draws from their first 6 home games. But come off the back of a really disappointing Leipzig performance, I thought. And not just because they lost, but also just the way in which they played. And I completely agree with you in the sense they looked jaded, they looked tired. They looked really quite ordinary against a pretty dynamic Leipzig side. And we talked about Leipzig, obviously at the start of the week and on the bonus show as well last night. Also, should point out that people can sign up for free trial if they want on the Gegenpressing Substack. If you just kind of want to listen to that show, you can always just take out a free trial and see what you think. You can always cancel it later if you're looking for a preview of that Friday night game. But yeah, I think they come up against a really formidable Mainz side. We know what Mainz did against Bayern. They were great against Bayern. I think they've obviously got a squad that is capable of causing problems on the road. I saw a crazy stat this week that prior to their last away defeat, which was against 4-3 to Wolfsburg, in the last away game, I think they've been undefeated on the road since March in the Bundesliga, which is just, absolutely crazy. But I think they're just kind of one of these teams that are really benefiting from having a huge amount of depth in that squad. Not a huge amount, obviously, but a huge amount for Mainz. Obviously, Jonathan Burkhardt's the guy who's been getting all the attention. He kind of hoovers up all the headlines, all the kind of interest in the club, because obviously he's a relatively young player. He's talking playing for Germany one day, but there's just so many players in that team that are doing relatively well. Philipp Mwane, the left wing back, Anthony Asasi, the right midfielder, Lee, who obviously got 2 goals against Bayern Munich. He's just continued to be a really solid player for Mainz over the years. and not to mention Amiri, the central midfielder as well, who's been great for them as well. And kind of as a result, I think they've picked up now more points at this point in the season than any season since 2010, 2011. So, Mainz are absolutely fine right now. Yes, they'll be without Jonathan Burkhardt. I think he's going to be out for a couple of weeks. So I don't think we're going to see him until the second half of the season at the earliest. So, look, they might be struggling with forward players. I think Sieb, the second striker, is probably going to end up playing up front in this game. So, it might not quite be the same Mainz team that we're used to, or the team that's been kind of, going from strength to strength in the Bundesliga this season. But I think the point is that there's so much more than just a one-man team. And they do look formidable on the road this season. So it's going to be a real test for Frankfurt, because the one thing they've been able to kind of fall back on time and time again this season is that home form. Dino Topmoller's really built a formidable team there who win at home and pick up points at home, even if they have struggled in away games in the Bundesliga and most notably in Europe as well. But Mainz can go there and pick up a win at the Deutsche Bank Park, or whatever it's called these days.
Waldstadion. Let's go with
there
that.
We go, yeah.
Waldstadion.
Exactly. I think that could be a really interesting kind of twist for things. Not to suggest that, Frankfurt have anything to worry about, but I think a Mainz win there would maybe underline your point, Manu, that Frankfurt maybe are kind of ending the season a little jaded.
I think the week off is going to really help them. It makes a big difference. I think when you have a week off, they have been undefeated at home against Mainz for 8 matches. That helps too. I saw an interesting rumor, and that is straight out of the Bayern Munich playbook. I would say that Johnny Burkhardt got linked with Eintracht Frankfurt as a potential Omar Mamouche replacement this week. And I was just thinking to myself, well played. Whoever leaked that rumor to the Bild Zeitung or whoever it was from the Eintracht Frankfurt camp knows exactly what they're doing. As you mentioned, Burkhardt is out. Stefan, also need to add, he's actually been called up to the German national team already recently by Julian Nagelsmann, right? So, him being out is a big miss, but Armando Sieb is a big talent. The other big story this week was, of course, that Mainz have a purchase option for 5 million euros to make him permanent from Bayern Munich, and it looks like they're going to trigger that. He's looked really good for them, and I mean, in with the chance of, look, Frankfurt is not going to be the only club wanting to sign Burkhardt. The way he's been playing and the way he's kind of been resurgent, I think it's only a matter of time until someone will try to sign him. But yeah, I think Sieb has been excellent. There's been this crazy story about Dominic Kor, and you and I laughed about that before the podcast, because there's all these stories that he could be called up by the German national team, and then you said, why would a 30-year-old be called up by the German national team? And I had to double check his Transfermarkt profile to actually see that he was actually 30, which made me feel really old, Stefan, because I remember when he first broke into the Bundesliga. But in fairness, maybe he's a bit old to go to the national team, although we have seen Julian Nagelsmann do crazier things. If he sees a player that can help him and help him right away, he'll do it. I personally think Robert Andrich probably fulfills that role very well. The role of the destroyer, creative destroyer that Dominic Kor is playing. He might not be called up by the German national team anytime soon, but he's been fantastic for Mainz. I mean, that is, no two ways about it. And I think he's been a really big part of why they have done so well, is because he does a very good job being disruptive for opponents. The Bayern Munich game, I think he really stood out. And I think that is a big reason why Mainz have been resurgent this year. There's other players too. Nebel comes to mind, Burkhardt, Lee. We can name a bunch of them, right? But yeah, he's definitely been one of those really good stories this year, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is just kind of what Mainz do, isn't it? Just one of these great clubs that just been able to kind of turn things around over and over and over again. Excuse me. I mean, I know you like to talk about Augsburg as this team who are perennially threatened with relegation, but always find a way to kind of avoid it last minute. But I think Mainz are probably an even better example of that. And I think Bo Henriksen deserves a huge amount of credit for that. He obviously came into the club not that long ago. Well, I think it was in February. I was just checking his stats there while you were talking there, and he's sitting on 1.66 points per game for Mainz, and that's a notable increase over his predecessor, compatriot, and frustratingly similar name in Bo Svensson. And it confuses the hell out of me on a weekly basis when I'm trying to remember which one I'm talking about, because obviously Bo Svensson's not that far away. Obviously at Union Berlin now. But Bo Svensson had a points per game record of 1.38. Henriksen's 1.66. And that's actually the best record of any Mainz long-term head coach since, Jorn Andersen back in 2009. And that wasn't even that long a period. But, we're talking about a better record than Thomas Tuchel right now, Martin Schmidt, whole bunch of guys there who've obviously done a good job.
What was Klopp's record at Mainz? Do you have that?
Well, I don't have it, but Transfermarkt has it. His was 1.5. Yeah, so it's better than Jurgen Klopp's now. Now, obviously, he's only been in charge for 29 games, so obviously we'll hold our horses there. But I think they deserve a huge amount of credit. I think he's an impressive head coach. I'm not by any means, an expert in Swiss football, but I think he had a lot of fans at FC Zurich who he took from basically a team that were, bottom of the table and dragged them back to where they maybe should be. And interesting enough, his points per game right now at Mainz is more or less identical to what it was at FC Zurich before he left the club. So it's good to see him kind of doing well and Mainz doing well. And
yeah,
they just continue to fly under the radar, Manu. And I think finishing the season with a win at Frankfurt would be a great example of that. And, we've been talking about different head coaches that deserve more credit. Last week, we obviously talked about Ole Werner, Werner Bremen. And yeah, I think, and we'll talk about another one at Freiburg in a moment's time, but yeah, I think Bo Henriksen, pound for pound, has probably done as well as anyone in the Bundesliga this season.
Yeah, we interviewed Bo Henriksen on the Substack last year, right around. It was shortly after they got smashed by Bayern Munich. I think it was 8-1, and it was a really interesting to talk to him. I wrote that interview afterwards, and it's one of those where when you interview a person and every time you ask a question, you get 10 minutes of audio back, and then you have to narrow that down, and you have like 5 to 10 questions, and you essentially have 50 minutes of audio from those questions, and then you need to narrow that down to 1,000 words. It's very hard. But the sense of that I got from speaking to him was a lot of energy, and really trying to get. When he came in, the first thing he said, like, yeah, I have a playing philosophy, but right now we need to rescue this club, so that doesn't really matter. We just need to get the basics right, and then we can worry about all that other stuff later on. And it was very pragmatic, but it was also very emotional, which are two things that don't always fit together, but in this case really do. He has a ton of energy. Like you could, I did this interview via Zoom, and it radiated over doing the Zoom all the way from Mainz to where I was sitting on Vancouver Island. You could feel the energy radiating through that Zoom call, and yeah, I he is someone I think that it burns really bright, and the players have obviously bought in, and you mentioned his record at Zurich, and he pointed that out a few times. I mean, the article's still up. I think it's still very, very much current to what he's doing at Mainz now. So if you want a bit more, might share it actually after this for people, because I think it's really good, and it gives you a ton of insight on who he is as a person, and obviously the things that he outlined needed to be done, he has accomplished and more. And I think that speaks for him as a person, as a coach. And yeah, Mainz, it's also kind of crazy how Mainz keep doing this. You mentioned this long list of coaches.
Yeah.
And Bo Svensson, the guy he replaced, we have to mention it too. Bo Svensson wasn't fired by Mainz. He left on his own merit, and is doing since pretty good at Union Berlin, right? He's also a really good coach. There's Thomas Tuchel, there's Jürgen Klopp. the list goes on and on and on. And, there's I think that deserves a lot of credit for what Mainz have been doing. And it's just remarkable how they just keep finding these really good coaches. And yeah, Mainz are looking good right now.
Yeah, I mean, I remember interviewing Bo Svensson when he was the Mainz manager not that long ago. It was just after COVID, I suppose. And I completely same sort of thing. I remember just being quite impressed with just how relaxed he was. And that just kind of seems to be the thing over and over again in Mainz. They just provide a very good, atmosphere or working condition for these head coaches just to kind of get on with their job. And they're almost like, those kind of Silicon Valley kind of incubators or something where it's just where talented people can kind of find the time and patience to kind of develop their skills, and that's what Mainz just seem to do over and over again. And long may it continue, because it's a great little quirk of the Bundesliga, which has been there since I've started covering it, probably over 10 years ago now. More than that, actually, probably closer to 15 years. Mainz have always been that club to me, and it's great that that's a kind of proud tradition that's kind of continued on to this day.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think, they're part of Bundesliga folklore, aren't they? The Karnevalsverein, and yeah, it's a really good story. And I think this year they're going to have a really good season. All right, let's move on to our next match. That's the Sunday Topspiel. And I think, other than the match on Friday night, it actually really deserves that billet. As I said, there's very many good games this weekend. Leverkusen against Freiburg. This is going to be a great match. And of course, when this game kicks off, we will know what Bayern and Leipzig have done, right? So, Leverkusen could make it very interesting in this match. It's not a given that they win this, because Freiburg are currently sitting in 5th place. And for them too, if Bayern Munich beat Leipzig, they can draw even on points with Leipzig, So it's not like that Freiburg are going to be pushovers here. This is going to be an incredibly interesting game, Stefan.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to have a really kind of added kind of metric too in terms of what happens on Friday night, obviously, because if Bayern do drop points, then everyone's going to have their eyes on whether Leverkusen can turn the screw and kind of pick up the points that's expected of them. And that's kind of something that has defined Leverkusen last season. They have that kind of winning edge. They had that mentality, as you would say, like mentality monsters, to kind of take advantage of situations, which is obviously how they won the Bundesliga last year. And it's something that's often dogged the teams that we associate as the title challengers, most obviously being Dortmund, who it felt like for years and years, whenever Bayern dropped points, we would then sit down and watch Dortmund and watch them drop points as well. There'd be an opportunity lost. You could maybe apply that to Frankfurt this season, who a couple of times have kind of dropped points and, maybe should have been ahead or far closer to Bayern in the league table, if not for some, crazy defending and things like that. But yeah, Leverkusen come up against the Freiburg side, who are looking very, very good. I've been super impressed with them this season. As we kind of said, probably one of the most kind of improved teams in the Bundesliga this year. And, looking at their stats, it's not really something, it's not as if there's been a kind of revolution at Freiburg. It's more like kind of evolution. We're obviously seeing Julian Schuster just kind of step into Christian Streich shoes, realizing they fit quite well, and he's just kind of running with them. Because, when I look at Freiburg's stats, you can see that they're still very much playing the same way as last season. They've just improved a lot. They've improved their defending, they've improved their attacking, they hold on to the ball a lot better, they're doing slightly more counter-attacking, but they're still very much a team that they're not a team who's going to kind of press you off the pitch. They're not going to harass teams off the pitch. They take their time, they play their own style of football, and in the same sort of sense, they pick up the results that you would expect from a Christian Streich side, whereas maybe dropping points in bigger games, for example, that home tie against Wolfsburg is maybe a perfect example of it last weekend, where, it's technically a team that Freiburg would say they're better than, at least at home, so they win it, but then equally they then have these games against the big teams and they routinely lose them. perhaps the most obvious example, and maybe to the constant annoyance of Freiburg fans, is it's as if RB Leipzig are like their kryptonite from time to time. But you can even throw in the 4-0 defeat to Dortmund, the 2-0 defeat to Bayern Munich. It's still very much the same Freiburg side in the sense that, and this is what I was saying all of last season, they win the games they're expected to win, and they tend to struggle against the bigger sides, and that's because of the way they play the football. They play the football where they more or less try to exert their style of football on the game, which works when they're playing another mid-table team or a team below them in the league table, but it doesn't quite work well when they come up against better sides. And unfortunately, Schuster and his team, they're coming up against a very good team in Leverkusen. Having said that, there is an interesting quirk to this, which I hadn't really realised until I was kind of doing some research for this game. If we take a look at Leverkusen's home record this season, the thing that really is quite interesting is that when they've played decent teams at the Bayer Arena in the Bundesliga, they haven't exactly been exceptional. So I'll just kind of run through their home games so far this season. So we're talking, the first home game was against Leipzig, which they obviously lost 3-2. Then they played Wolfsburg, which is a very kind of hard-fought match, which is a 4-3 win. They then drew 2-2 with Holstein Kiel. They then beat Frankfurt 2-1, admittedly. Then drew 0-0 with Stuttgart, beat Heidenheim, and then beat St. Pauli. But in amongst all that, there has been quite a lot of questionable performances, far from exceptional performances. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I'm trying to kind of drum up a narrative here, but I feel like maybe beating Freiburg at home would probably actually be quite a good, well, obviously it's good as 3 points, but I think it'll almost be like an important thing for Xabi Alonso's team to do, because they've obviously had this really difficult start to the season. To the extent that maybe 7 or 8 games into the season, we thought, well, things have this team has just completely fallen apart. But they've kind of managed to kind of get things back on track. They've now won 4 games in a row in the Bundesliga. Coming up against a good Freiburg side in the Bayer Arena, I think is a really big test for them. And if they can get over that line for this game, I think Xabi Alonso will be quite content with the idea that his team have maybe turned things around and they're in pretty decent shape for the second half of the season.
Yeah, I mean, you want to hear a really crazy stat about Freiburg and playing against title holders? They haven't beaten a title holder at that stadium, at the title holder stadium, since 1998-1999 season. That was in 1999 against Kaiserslautern, 1-0.
This is what I'm telling you. It's Freiburg. They only win the games they're expected to win. It's in their DNA. I don't know why, but it's in their DNA.
I mean, and I think too, I mean, you mentioned the sort of the lack of good results Leverkusen had at the start of the season. I think they have significantly improved over the last few weeks. I think the best game was the one against Inter, where they were really dominant, and the 1-0 really doesn't describe what they actually did on the field. And when you look at the XG, for example, the XG against them has dropped from 1.24 to 0.8 per game from the start of the season to now. So, they're better defensively again. They fixed sort of the defensive issues that they had at the start of the season. And I think also from like a control aspect, and I think this is the one really big thing that has hurt Bayer Leverkusen to start the season, was the form of Granit Xhaka. He obviously played the Euros with an injury, then came back into the season, and you could tell that he wasn't 100% fit. And he has returned to the sort of level that we've seen him play last year. And with his, return of form, this entire team is just better, right? You're no longer relying on essentially Florian Wirtz rescuing you match day from match day, because if you have Granit Xhaka being in full form, you just control the match better, right? And all the players around you are getting better. And I think this last year, the key for Bayer Leverkusen was, of course, Florian Wirtz's form, but also how Granit Xhaka played. And the third thing, and this is something that I think we yet to see to come back, was the way Lukas Hradecky outperformed in goal, right? And that is an issue that we've addressed many times, but it looks like Xabi Alonso has fixed a lot of the other issues. The defense is better. They have much better control in midfield. I mean, Florian Wirtz, we don't need to talk about him. He has been the only player, I think, in this entire team that has sort of performed throughout, right? Like, I can't remember him dropping off at all this season ever, right? So, that's certainly been, and it's probably also why they're still in this title race, Had it not been for Florian Wirtz and him, and you make this point many times, and I agree with you here, he has basically tracked Bayer Leverkusen so many times, out of situations where they should have maybe lost and even dropped even more points. Like the fact that they can make it within 2 points of Bayern Munich by the end of this match day, that is more or less his doing. And you know what? Even if it stays by 4 points, I think this title race is far from being over. And especially because of Leverkusen, and I think Leverkusen are going to do some things in the winter as well. My suspicion is that they're going to strengthen that side, because I know that they're not quite happy on how the transfer window has worked out. So I think that there's going to be something happening there. But yeah, they can make it absolutely interesting, and with that in mind, I think this is going to be an extremely complicated game for Freiburg. I just wanted to point out one thing with Julian Schuster and the way he's come in and really improved this team. I think it really speaks. There's always this kind of criticisms like, oh, maybe they would have been better last year too without Christian Streich. But Christian Streich himself realized the time had come. We sort of see that very similar story emerge, at a much bigger, larger scale at Liverpool, right, where Arne Slot has come in to replace Jurgen Klopp, and now Liverpool are firing out of all of cylinders. Can't speak right now. But it's like a similar parallel, and I don't think you shouldn't then say, oh, the previous coach was bad. It's just, a sign of maybe at some point you have to replace the coaches in order to get a team or squad that is obviously very good. And this Freiburg team is not Liverpool, but, by Bundesliga standards, this is a good side. This is a top 6 side, in my opinion. And they were last year too, and it just didn't work anymore because the coach was obviously tired. The squad was getting too used to the same voice in the dressing room, right? That can be comfortable, which is not a good thing in professional sports. You don't want to be too comfortable. And Julian Schuster has just brought a little bit more of a new impetus, and I think that can really help in a team like Freiburg. And then, of course, I think the other big factor is they don't have international football this year, right? That helps too.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It kind of helps as well that like a lot of these players can kind of just carry on to an extent with the kind of it's the status quo to an extent kind of carried on. Freiburg's 2 biggest players this season, I think, have been Vincenzo Grifo on one side and Enrico Doan on the other. And, we're talking about 2 kind of Freiburg, veterans, if you will, in a sense. Grifo certainly. And the fact that the 2 of them have just been able to just kind of continue doing what they've been doing. And you've obviously got guys like Christian Ginter in there as well, who's, Matthias Ginter and Christian Gunter as well, I was trying to say there. The team's just kind of full of, players that obviously knew how to do things under Christian Streich, and Schuster just has not tried to change things up. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens if he does have to start changing things up, if there are injuries, if he has to try and do tactics, then that will obviously be, where Julian Schuster does have to kind of earn his wages perhaps, but I think he probably learned from the best. Freiburg are obviously well suited and well oiled to work a certain way. And I think they look fantastic. But yeah, I think going to the Bayer Arena and beating Leverkusen will be a big test because, as you said, Leverkusen look like they've kind of managed to weather the storm. They look hungry, they look angry, they look like they want to win games. You're absolutely right. Florian Wirtz has been in incredible form. 5 goals and assists in his last 5 Bundesliga games. He's scored or assisted in every single game. Not to mention, his form in the Champions League as well and the Pokal. So, I had someone this week kind of debate with me about Florian Wirtz because I said, when he moves, he'll probably go for 130, 140 million euros, and this guy responded saying no chance. I was like, well, why do you say that? He's like, he's no better than Julian Brandt. I was like, I'm sorry, hold on a minute. And I was like, well, I said, Julian Brandt left Leverkusen for 25 million euros.
Name the person. You need to shame this person.
It was somebody on TikTok.
Oh my God.
And then the guy said, "Did you even watch Julian Brandt at Leverkusen?" To which I responded saying, "I interviewed Julian Brandt at Leverkusen," so that kind of ended the conversation. But not to kind of poor Julian Brandt catching strays here, of course, while we're talking about Leverkusen versus Freiburg. But as I've said on the show already this season, the difference, and we talked about this when we were talking about Germany and the way that Musiala and Wirtz have come in there and replaced guys like Julian Brandt. But the key thing for me with Wirtz is he's just a stone cold killer. He's just this guy who has to win every game. And I was actually thinking about it. I was walking my dog because just the way that he kind of made that comparison between Brandt and Florian Wirtz, and that is kind of what I do. I go out for long walks in the countryside with my dog and think about ways that I can eviscerate people on social media.
There's a lesson here, Stefan. Like, TikTokers should be banned.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But you know what though, the way I kind of came down on it when I was trying to think about the way that Brandt and Wirtz are is, I think the difference between the two of them is that Florian Wirtz walks onto the pitch every weekend knowing that he's the best player in his team, and he knows that, and to an extent that he knows that then means the responsibility is on him to win the game, because he knows if I don't do it, no one else will. Whereas I don't think Julian Brandt has ever thought I'm the best player on the pitch.
It's a wild comparison. Like, I mean, I'm baffled.
I know.
I've interviewed both Florian Wirtz. I think I actually was one. I know this for a fact because they made a big point out of it. I was the first media person to interview Florian Wirtz, and that interview is still on Transfermarkt, and this was a few years ago. And I've interviewed Julian Brandt, and it's I mean, it just, no offense, like, they're not the same person or player. Like, you can't.
Of course.
You can't. Anyways, it's not fair to Julian Brandt either, because he's a good player. He's he's just
a great
completely different role.
Anyway, we've gone way off track. We should talk about Julian Brandt. Maybe we should wrap things up and move on to the final.
I'm just still baffled by this comparison. It's just very wild. And I also just the characters are just so different. And I mean, you and I. You've interviewed Julian Brandt, I mean, we have spoken to both many times. Anyways, let's move on. I'm lost for words a little bit. I apologize. All right, let's move to the last game, and this is Wolfsburg against Dortmund. This is the game that sees out the match day. The Bundesliga has done a good job for 2 weeks in a row now to have a very good match to see out the match day, right? We were treated with Leipzig against Frankfurt last week. We were treated with Wolfsburg against Dortmund this week. Both times a El Plastico team, quote unquote, involved against a big traditional, one of the biggest traditional clubs. But also, I think, again, a lot of storylines going into this match, right? We have this resurgent or much better Wolfsburg side. Yes, they're sitting in 10th place, but it's so tight, isn't it? In the middle of the table, a win and you can jump all the way up to 5th, and you lose and you're stuck in this no man's land. Dortmund are right there as well with 22 points. Both of these teams can really define what the storyline is going to be going into this winter break. I think Wolfsburg win this game. They're looking at the before winter break half of the season, not first half of the season, because that's not going to be concluded, and say, well, this has actually been really good for us. Equally, you can say the same about Dortmund, a win here, and, a lot of things get rectified, I think. But, and I think this is more true for Dortmund than Wolfsburg. Dortmund loses this game, there is a potential that they going into the winter break in 10th place. Just let that sink in for a moment. That is, I think, the worst since that last year under Jurgen Klopp, where everything went sideways, and they were, for a brief period, I think they were last in the Bundesliga. Kicker did a story today that, Nuri Sahin at the moment has the worst points per game average since Peter Bosch. We all know how well Peter Bosch ended up at Dortmund,
Poor Peter Bosch.
Poor Peter Bosch, didn't work for him at Dortmund or at Leverkusen. Was a good player for Hansa Rostock though, so there's that. I know nothing will happen if Nuri Sahin loses this game. Which is, I think, the even more baffling part about this entire storyline with Borussia Dortmund, because I think this season is still salvageable. But if they lose this game, we're looking down the barrel of a situation where they don't make the Champions League. And we discussed this earlier this week, or what would happen if Dortmund don't make the Champions League. Things can spiral out of control really quickly. This is a really important game for Dortmund. They have to win this, Stefan. And I don't think it's by any means guaranteed that they do.
Yeah, well, you can tell that Dortmund are feeling the pressure because they've been out in full media force this week. Sebastian Kehl's been out. I thought you made a really good point. He actually said, look, we have to win this game no matter what. Doesn't matter how we do it. Doesn't matter if it's sexy. Doesn't matter if it's a terrible game. We have to win it. And I do sometimes feel like they kind of keep Sebastian Kehl in some glass cabinet at the Westfalenstadion, and they kind of allow him out when things get really bad because he's the only one that seems to walk around that club saying, is anyone else a little disappointed that we don't seem to win more football games? Everyone else is up there kind of counting their Champions League coins, and they don't really mind about the malaise in the Bundesliga. He came out with that. I thought it's maybe can't be a coincidence that Lars Ricken was kind of rolled out to talk about a lot of kind of transfer stuff that kind of maybe distracts. He obviously went off and one about Jimmy Gittins saying they wouldn't sell him for 50 million euros. Then conveniently said that Dortmund once showed a lot of interest in signing Florian Wirtz before he went to Bayer Leverkusen. Just all these kind of hypothetical transfer stories that kind of distract from the fact that, as you said, if Dortmund don't win this game, they could finish 2024 in 10th place. I actually saw someone make that comment on one of our YouTube videos last week, saying, Dortmund are probably going to finish this year in 10th place. And I thought, that's a silly thing to say. That's just someone being a hater. And then I looked at the league table today. I was like, oh no, they're actually spot on. That's exactly what could happen.
They're going to finish 10th and win the Champions League. There's my crazy take for 2025.
God almighty.
In Munich, like they did the last time.
That would be something.
Cut that and record it just in case it happens, and I can say I predicted it.
Well, do you know what though? Like it's. But on a serious note though, if whether Nuri Sahin will still be there, I mean, it's worth pointing out that Edin Terzic more or less did the same thing last season. He didn't even keep his job. Obviously, to win the Champions League, get into a final, still mightily impressive for a Dortmund head coach. But yeah, it's still a complete mess, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of ramifications will come if they do end up finishing the year in 10th place. Yes, you can make the argument that they have had their injuries, but I mean that team that went out and kind of stumbled against Hoffenheim was by no means a bad team. Obviously I had Emre Can in defence, but aside from that, we're talking about, a forward line of Guirassy, Gittins, Maximilian Bayer, and I know Bayer probably should be playing as a number 9, but either way, that's still like a front three of costing. I mean, Guirassy and Bayer themselves cost at least 50 million euros. Ricken said this week that Gittins would sell him for 50 million euros. So you're talking about 3 players there worth about 100 million euros at least. And then you've got Nemcha, who obviously costs a lot of money behind him, Pascal Gross, in there, and of course Gio Reyna, who's the guy who got the goal against Hoffenheim. But it'll be interesting to see what happens here because Dortmund have really kind of struggled to score goals recently. Over the course of the last 5 games, they've got 8 goals, but it's worth bearing in mind that 4 of those came in the 4-0 win over Freiburg, so they've only picked up 3 goals in the last 3 games. And maybe that would have been excusable a few weeks ago when Gittins was still out, when Duranville was still out. Adeyemi wasn't coming back. Guirassy was maybe out, I think, as well. But Dortmund have plenty of options in attack, and there's just really no excuse. So they go into this game under a lot of pressure, I think. I think Nuri Sahin's under a lot of pressure. There's some report and kicker, they kind of fabled, everyone at the club thinks he does a great job with the training and he gets on well with everyone else and it's all to a very high standard, blah, 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 blah. That's all just kind of background noise compared to actual results on the board. And he's simply not doing that right now. And whereas I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks of that of the season might have been excusable for poor performances, I think they've got more or less the squad that he was always going to have. I mean, yes, there are problems with this team. There's huge problems with this squad. They don't have any fullbacks. and then still rely on Niklas Sula to be a central defender for a top-class team, which is going to cause anyone issues. But
worse, Emre
Can. These are the issues that they chose to have because they chose not to sign any other players in the summer. It's not as if they signed 6 defenders and 4 of them have been injured all season. So I think they're up against it because they're up against a very decent Wolfsburg side who've done well, who, by the way, they win this game, are only a handful of points off a Champions League spot at the end of 2024. And it's a completely different situation. And, I'm not entirely surprised because I've been saying for years and years that Dortmund should have signed Ralph Hasenhüttl as a head coach. No, not that anyone would listen to me, of course, but it's just bizarre. We just talked about Bo Henriksen there as well, a very seasoned, not very seasoned. He's I think in his 40s, but he's earned his stripes at different clubs, as is Ralph Hasenhüttl, and Dortmund have all these head coaches around them that they could have picked, and they've just kind of plucked this kind of young guy from their own academy, well, not from their own academy, but from their own kind of backroom staff because he's a former player. And I don't know, it just kind of feels to me like chickens are coming home to roost, but we'll see how they do.
I think they're conceding too many goals, to your point, right? It's like this year, this season, so far, I mean, they're scoring lots. On average, they're scoring 2.14 goals, which is more than they did last year under Edin Terzic. But they're also conceding way more goals. They're conceding on average 1.45 goals. Last year under Terzic was 1. That's a big drop, or like a big rise rather, right? In goals conceded. And there lies the problem. The Hoffenheim game is a great example where they sleepwalk to that equalizer, right? Same happened against Bayern Munich. Those are points dropped that are unnecessarily dropped. They could have, I think, won those games with a better, more mature defensive performance. And yes, they brought in Waldemar Anton to stabilize things, but he's injured, and that's not great. And now Emre Can is playing center back, and they signed Jan Kuto as a fullback, which you point out. Jan Kuto is an extremely exciting, young, talented player who probably likes to attack more than defend, and that's an issue. And I think that is something that they just refuse to fix, and have refused to fix for many years now. And then I am still baffled how Fabian Hürzeler, if he was available, didn't end up at Dortmund. If you know that coach is available, you got to do it.
Well, I'll tell you why, Manu, because Dortmund haven't signed a proper head coach in about 10 years.
Yeah. No, I mean, Tuchel was the last, right?
It's that, and I'm sure everyone knows less about this in the last kind of couple of years, but if you actually look at the amount of money that Dortmund spend on forward players and midfielders compared to defenders, it's baffling.
Yeah, because you can sell them for lots of money afterwards. That is the entire business model, right?
See, and this is what frustrates me, because if you say right now Dortmund should sack Nuri Sahin because he hasn't been good enough, you will get Dortmund fans saying, well, come on now, he's had to deal with injuries to Waldemar Anton, as you just mentioned, to Niklas Sula. But the point is that they only have 3 central defenders in their entire squad. That's mad. That's mad for any team in a top flight. There'll be Sunday league teams playing throughout Scotland this weekend with more central defenders on their bench than Dortmund have available to them. And they have to play Michan. They don't have to. They could have signed someone. And the exact same goes for the fullbacks. They could say, oh, well, Rierson's been out injured. Sign another one. There's no rules. There's no rule by UEFA that says Dortmund aren't allowed to have more than 4, 5, 6 central defenders in the squad. But they continue to overlook these things. They always have, and they always get into trouble for it. And the crazy thing is that Benzemaini, I think, has actually had a really good start to the season. He's looked quite competent, and it's been purely out of desperation. They've just kind of thrown him in the deep end, and they said we've got literally no one else that can play left back, and they should be counting their lucky stars that he's actually put in some decent performances, because right now you can go through that entire back line, and you can even point a finger at Gregor Kobel, who I think has been outstanding for years, for a number of years. Even he's looking pretty poor this season. So you're absolutely right. Sorry to just totally cut you off there.
No, but
yeah,
you bang on, and I mean, like, that you can make a point that they haven't developed a top world-class centre-back themselves since leaving Subotic and Mats Hummels under Jurgen Klopp in 2010.
Yeah.
That's
and
14 years ago.
By Bayern as well, technically.
Yeah, but like he did manage his big breakthrough at Borussia Dortmund. You make that's fair. Mats Hummels is a funny one, but that's Jurgen Klopp was ultimately the one who said, okay, I'm going to play two. I think at the time they were like 20. They were the youngest centre back pairing in the Bundesliga. I'm going to play them, and they haven't really done that. And of course, people will say, well, about Schlotterbeck. Yeah, I mean, yes, he's an exciting player. He really is. And, I think he has improved and he's getting better, but, he doesn't have anyone next to him. Waldemar Anton, we have to see whether, he was successful at Stuttgart because of Hoeneß or whether, it was because of he's a good player. These things remain to be seen. And they haven't really done anything themselves. There's lots of players out the academy that are coming through now, and we'll see if they work out. But yeah, it's very different, and it's very different to the team that they're facing this weekend, right? I mean, Wolfsburg have been really good plucking out defenders, and even when some of the defenders like Lacroix, for example, who really wanted out, when he leaves, then they find other ones. Like when Favre and Koulirakis were available for lots of Bundesliga clubs. It just went this summer, and Wolfsburg were the ones who signed them, and yeah, it's an interesting kind of what if kind of game, because like, as you said, Hasenhüttl would be a good fit to Dortmund, and I think there's also some players in the Wolfsburg team that might probably make Dortmund better too. But if you're on good Volkswagen money, why would you go to Dortmund right now? I guess the big story in Germany is right now that a lot of these car manufacturing jobs are going to the weapons industry. So maybe you can do a parallel between Volkswagen and Rheinmetall.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think Hasenhüttl's in a very different situation from Nuri Sahin, where he's almost got too many players, and he's having to basically cut through them all and kind of decide who can actually do a decent job for him. And I think where Dortmund fans will be crying out for some new signings in January, I think Wolfsburg will probably be looking to shed a few players, particularly some senior ones who maybe outstayed their welcome. But yeah, I mean, I was about to go to rant about Waldemar Anton there, because I was going to say, look, he's a good central defender, and I know he obviously hit a new level maybe at Stuttgart the last couple of years, but He's Waldemar Anton. He's a 28-year-old solid Bundesliga defender. He's not some 21-year-old who's going to develop into the next Mats Hummels or Van Dijk or something like that. See if Dortmund were a serious football club, Waldemar Anton would be the third or fourth choice central defender of that club.
Well, instead of signing Waldemar Anton, they would have signed Sebastian Hoeneß.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. Yeah, but you know what? This is and this honestly goes to my fundamental issue with Dortmund, which is Watzke. He doesn't want a head coach in there who'll ask too many questions, and and that's what kind of brings us full circle with this Nuri Sahin thing, in the sense that you can make excuses for Nuri Sahin, saying he doesn't have the right players, he doesn't have the squad depth, he's had injuries, but I think an experienced head coach like Ralph Hasenhüttl would be kicking in the front door of the boardroom saying, guys, I need another central defender. I need a right back. I need a left back. Gregor Kobel's exhausted, being a backup goalkeeper, blah, 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 blah. Why do we have 47 right wingers, but I only have 3 senior central defenders? And for the longest time, going all the way back maybe to Thomas Tuchel, Dortmund's hierarchy have always ensured that they have, I don't want to say a convenient fool, because that's really harsh, and I know there's a lot of people who had in that job who obviously who mean well and work very hard for the club, but it's convenient for, I mean, Terzic and now Nuri Sahin were completely beholden to Dortmund for this opportunity, so they're obviously not going to question, they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them too much in that regard. Whereas someone like Hasenhüttl came in at Wolfsburg, and within the first week, he was complaining about the home fans not being passionate enough. Now, yeah, you can make jokes about that and say, well, that's Wolfsburg being Wolfsburg, it's all plastic fans. But it's obviously a guy with high standards who's not afraid to turn around and say, guys, we're here, we got to be here, we got to raise the standard. And if that means turning around to the fans and tell them off, then that's what it takes.
As Austrian though, right? Like, they speak their mind.
Yeah, well, exactly.
I mean, like I know this from my own family.
Yeah, well, exactly, and it's maybe they just need to get maybe Hasenhüttl will be Dortmund manager next year. That'd be an interesting one.
I would like that. I think he would deserve a job like that. I think, and he has shown that he can develop talents. He did it at Leipzig, he did it at Southampton. I would argue he's doing it currently at Wolfsburg. If he wants to do this, because again, we're talking about a guy who was close to retirement. Does he really go from a job at Wolfsburg where you leave the training ground and the city quote unquote of Wolfsburg, you're not going to be bothered by the media, etc. Whereas in Dortmund, you are in a media storm every match day, right? And I wonder if that's something he's interested in. So that's the only thing. But yeah, I mean, this is going to be
it's a nice what if to end the story, end the podcast on.
Absolutely, and this is going to be an interesting game to watch, I think, because there's a ton of storylines going into this match. Just like last week, the final match of the match day is a good one, and I think there's going to be some really good football on display too, just as it was the case last week as well. So yeah, tune into that one, enjoy it, because then we're going to have a few weeks without Bundesliga football. So I think it is really worth tuning into.